inside the recording studio. My name is Jody Sides, and with me as always is Mr. Chris Selstrom.
That was ingenious, Jody.
I
love it. How you doing today,
annoying,
man?
Too.
Yes, it certainly was. And I work with you. Holy shit.
Sorry.
What are we talking about?
We are talking about the sweet sexiness of de-essers.
Yeah.
I certainly hope the de-esser that I use on this podcast will help that.
Yeah. A de-esser is one of those things that it's not super fun to talk about or even to buy, oh, I got a new de-esser. Ooh, that's cool.
That's the first thing I call you about every week.
Exactly. Hey, have you heard new de-essers? Yeah. But it is a tool that we don't miss until we really need one.
Damn straight.
And
not going to argue that point at all.
Yeah. No, because it just like the intro to this podcast, this episode, right?
Yeah.
That's supremely annoying. And
I wonder how many people have already turned the podcast off and like, I'm not listening to this episode now.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Can you hear the way he did that intro this time? That was so lame. If people are unaware of what a de-esser is and what a de-esser does, it essentially, for the simple terms, is like it listens for those S's and attenuates them. And it kind of evens them out, the performance somewhat. The first question might be, well, why wouldn't I just use an EQ, Jody?
You can, and this is how de-essing actually came about in my understanding of recording history. When sibilance, which is that whole concept of the sound, comes through, back before we had dedicated de-essers, the way it was dealt with is you had an EQ and a compressor working in conjunction with each other, and you would use that to attenuate the specific frequency so that the compressor would hit extra hard at that point. And it wasn't the most effective method, or you also could do it in the exact opposite fashion of where you would use the opposite of the frequency and you'd bring that value down where the sibilance is really hitting. And then you'd use the compressor to bring everything else back up once you've notched out that frequency, so to speak. But de-essers in and of themselves have now been on the market for quite some time, and it makes the job of getting rid of sibilance, especially in vocals, but sibilance can also kind of happen in other instruments, a whole lot easier to deal with and remove.
Yeah. And of course, if you're using just an EQ to kind of adjust for those S's, you're affecting the signal even when those S's aren't present.
Well, so yes, you can. And that was much more difficult in the era of hands-on on a console dealing with it in real time. However, I have gone the Mutt Lange anal bizarreness route of automating an EQ to only flip on that particular band when needed.
Yes.
And then turn it back off when not needed.
Sure. My point that I wanted to make there before I was so rudely interrupted.
Jeez. Okay, I'm going to go sit in my corner now.
Go sit in your corner. Is that this noise happens at 2.2K, let's say, just to have a value. Right? Now, if you're attenuating that just on an EQ and statically have it sitting on your track, then you're affecting the sound of that track throughout, even when these S's aren't present.
Right.
So just like you described there, you could do it with an automation where you just kind of activate that band as that happening. But that's effectively what a de-esser does for you.
Yep.
You don't want to necessarily just remove those with an EQ and leave it there because you're affecting the sound. Right. The de-esser does that for you. And one thing that I think is important to keep in mind that when we're mixing is, let's say the example of vocals here again. In that range, we have this sort of presence about the vocal where it sounds possibly clear and articulate and all those nice things that we want. But it's very easy to overdo that process where it just becomes nasty and really fatiguing to have that throughout the whole track, as it were.
Yes.
it's an important thing that we want to kind of take care of, because you want the cleanliness and the clarity, but you don't want the constant that kind of thing, right? And it's
because
just like,
it drills
oh my
and
God.
bores into your skull and your ears.
Yeah, and then you find yourself like, oh, I can't listen to this track, you know? So
You know what?
It-
Let's before we dive into the whole concept of the use of the de-esser and everything, especially now that you're mentioning and really promoting the concept of let's use this on a vocal, which is the primary reason for its invention. However, that being said, if you are the recording engineer dealing with the vocalist that's doing this, your best bet is to get the appropriate microphone for that voice before you even press record.
sure thing.
That
Absolutely.
will deal with the whole concept of sibilance right off the bat.
Yeah, it's again that idea of getting it right at the source, right? And so many people are talking about that all the time. We hear get it right at the source. And somebody like we mention all the time, like an Al Schmidt or something, he probably never had to use a de-esser in his whole life, right? Because he would get it right at the source. These tools are there if we need them. And if it's one of those things where you might get fooled when you're tracking, like, oh my God, this is just the clarity and it sounds so good. And you can hear the top end and this and that. And I can hear every articulation in the singer's voice. But then once you get a little compression on it and you're tweaking it a little bit, now it's just obnoxious. And it's like, oh my God, get rid of that, you know?
Yes.
But it's a very good point that you bring up there with choice of microphone.
Yeah, it can make a huge difference on a vocalist's voice.
Right.
Whereas, let's say a U87A might sound really nice on my voice. And then I might go for some kind of Groove Tubes 200 series. I don't know. I'm just making it up, pulling a name and number out of my hat and my butt. And that mic might be super brittle in a particular frequency on my voice, and suddenly sibilance comes out everywhere.
Yeah. The lesson in there, of course, is we always get blinded by, a certain microphone name, and we're like, well, this is a great mic. Yeah, it might be, and it probably is, but is it the right mic for
that
this
voice.
Particular singer? Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
and that song for that matter.
Right. It's one of those things, again, like you're getting it right, but don't be afraid to use an air quote here, lesser mic if it's the appropriate one.
That sounds good on the voice. All right. Now that we've gone off on the deep end of a tangent, let's get back into our de-esser vibe.
Let's do that. Vocals, I'm thinking that's the primary function for this. It's not the only thing, but if we bore a little bit deeper into vocals and your de-essing, where do you find for you where the frequency where you might reach for initially to kind of start de-essing?
This is going to be ding, da, ding, 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 program dependent upon the person that you're dealing with, because male voices will have a different frequency range from female voices. So take a sip.
You don't say.
I do say.
I will. Yeah. Content dependent. Cheers, everybody.
Generally speaking, with most male voices, you're probably looking somewhere around the 2 to 2.2K range. And with female voices, you're probably looking somewhere around the 2.2-ish, maybe on up, close to 3, depending on the female. So the male voice is probably a little bit wider than that. It just depends on their tonal quality of them and the mic that they're being paired with.
Yeah.
But that's the general.
Yeah. So we're kind of looking at that
2 to 3K range.
Right. I would say, well, depending on some use, but the vocal, you're right. That's about that range. And you'll have to, depending on which de-esser that you're using, you'd have to probably sweep a little bit up there and just listen to see that you're affecting the appropriate range. Yeah.
Now, there's another point of nastiness that can happen, and this also relates to multiple instruments other than the voice, and that is right around the 4.1K range. That is just a shrill, nasty area for pretty much everybody's listening unpleasure.
It's very piercing, isn't it?
It's a very piercing frequency. If there's a problematic area in a particular recorded track, that's also another one where you want to look at and it's like, hey, is that where that sibilance is really killing my ears?
If you're using a de-esser, it can also be very tempting to overcook the attenuation that we do.
Oh, yeah.
So don't be too aggressive with it. You have to obviously just use your ear. It's always the right thing to do.
Are you saying salt to taste?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and be careful with the garlic. It's tempting to perhaps just, I just want to pull that out all the way. But now you can lose some of that clarity and you can just make the track in question sound really unnatural. So,
especially if you're going along and there's a certain amount of clarity going on in the vocal and then you hit the sound of the sibilance and it suddenly gets very, very dull for a moment.
Yeah.
It can be very obvious.
Absolutely. We have to be careful. Use with care, but it really does a huge difference on your tracks. Now, on a technical tangent here, when you place a de-esser on, let's say we're talking vocals here, where in the chain do you place your de-esser? Do you do it after the processing, compression, EQ? Do you do it before? Do you do it both? What do you do?
It will depend on the program, but 90% of the time I'm putting it as the first thing in the chain.
Yeah.
So that I'm not dealing with a ton of other processing on the actual sibilance. It just, to me, makes it a lot easier to deal with. Sometimes it's really bad and you have to do it at the beginning, then you do some processing, and then you do it again at the end.
Yeah. That's a common thing, I think, especially for people that mix pop tracks and stuff, because we want that sort of ultra clarity of the vocal, right? Yeah, placing it close to the beginning of your vocal chain is a good idea because you're not exacerbating the problem with like compressors and things before you do the processing. So you're forcing the de-esser to do a heavier handed job. And you're probably not going to get the same benefits, I was going to say, if it has to do that, because then it has to work harder and you get more drastic results. So,
right. And with that, because we work hard and we want some benefits, here's a word from our sponsors. And we're back. And I kind of cut you off a little bit briefly there, but do you have anything else you want to add before we boot on to another type of instrument to use with a de-esser?
No, I think that's pretty much how I like to deal it with vocals. I mean, I put it early on in the chain, get rid of that.
You also do it early on then?
I do, yes, absolutely. And then if need be at the end of the chain, but then it would be very gentle, I would say that, if it's needed at all. And 9 times out of 10, I put it early on in the chain and that's it. And that kind of takes care of the problem. So no, I think that's a big one. And it will really make your vocal hopefully have that sort of professional sheen that we're kind of going for, and that kind of takes care of it for me. So I don't have too much else to add with vocals. But are there other instruments, or what other situations do you tend to use it on?
Well, one particular instrument is drums, especially with cymbals and overheads. And
definitely, yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, with the particular frequency of around the 4.1K mark, overheads can get pretty harsh, and not so much sibilant, but it's in that sibilant style range from anywhere from about 3 to 4.5K. And in there, if they're really nasty sounding, having a de-esser on the overheads can help quite a bit to tame the nastiness that drills into your ear and makes you go, man, I don't want to listen to the drummer on this song anymore.
Yeah, especially with, I find that crashes, and depending on the drummer and their playing style, let's say that they're using sort of like a crash ride and they're hitting that, they might not back off enough to make that sound good during the recording and they're just bashing the crap out of that. That can very easily get super shrill, and it's just like, it just kind of takes over your whole track.
Oh, yes.
A de-esser is fantastic for that.
It's a
Same thing.
specialty EQ just for your crashes.
For your enjoyment only, yeah. And then, like you mentioned, it tends to go a little bit higher than you would with the vocal, but sweeping around there about 3 to 4K range, maybe even a little bit higher. Same rules, I would say, as with vocals here. Too aggressive of a use, and you'll kill the vibe of it.
You suck the life right out.
The reverse breath.
That's right.
It can sound unnatural. If you have a hard time EQing an overhead that can sound a little aggressive like that, which with an overhead, you want the clarity and everything, but if, it might sound great when playing the verse part or whatever with a hi-hat or whatever, but then when you get into this aggressive crash ridey stuff, it just takes over. So playing with the De-Esser there is fantastico. And I recommend it if we need it. Anything else they use it on? I think you've used it on guitars a little bit as well, right? Yeah.
I've used it on guitars, especially noisy, overdriven guitars where string noise from fingers gets overbearing. In addition to that, sometimes the pick aunch, as I would call it, can get a little bit ridiculous. And so you'd find where the aunch is of the pick hits on the strings and use a de-esser to kind of control those too. So if you don't have a specialty plugin like RX's Guitar Denoise, which deals with not only the high-end type stuff of squeals and squeaks, but it also deals with pick noise and amp noise and such, you can use a de-esser instead to actually deal with these high-pitched squeals and squeaks of guitars in your mix.
You're obviously an RX user, so do you find yourself reaching for a de-esser to take care of those issues anymore, or not so much?
Not on a guitar, no. I use the Guitar Denoise plugin for very specific things. It's a guitar-specific de-esser and de-hummer. It's got a couple of different functions built in, so I don't need to use a specialized de-esser just for guitars.
Yeah. What kind of frequency should you use it as a denoiser? Did you just kind of sweep and find what that was, or?
It depends on the squeal or squeak or whatever string noise I'm trying to get rid of, because some, depending on a player's fingers, squeal differently on the strings than other players. I mean, they're in the same general area, but it depends on the person. Some people might have more meatier feeling fingers on their strings, so they won't squeal quite as high as other people that might have smaller, less meaty fingers that might get a real high-pitched wail off of them somehow.
Yeah. And obviously we're not talking, or at least I'm not talking about, the John Sykes, Zach Wilde squeal with
those are like harmonics, so they're doing it on purpose.
But noise from sliding up and down between chords, that kind of thing, especially if you're playing with a lot of gain, or sometimes even if you're not, you get those kind of squeaks and stuff shifting positions that can, sometimes it's almost like a breath with vocals that we talked about.
Removing a breath.
Right. And it's like part of it is emotion, and sometimes it's just freaking annoying. So you have to get rid of that.
Are you using anything specialized? Are you using guitars with de-essers or what?
I don't. It's an RX thing for me as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if I need to do that. I find that if it's something
you're not going mutt-laying like anal and just like EQing it at the moment it happens then.
If it happens, let me backtrack and hopefully I'll answer your question.
Okay.
I tend to be so anal about that when I'm tracking, if it's me tracking and playing. that I get hyper vigilant. So I try to capture that and knock that shit out while I'm tracking.
Right.
Whether it would be audible in the mix or not. I'm like, nope, do that again, that type of thing.
Do you ever make yourself or another guitar player oil the strings to prevent that as well?
No, I haven't gotten that crazy.
Okay.
That's a trick I actually learned from a long time ago from a producer called Peter McIan, who used to work with Men at Work and things like that. But he did a seminar one time I attended, and he said, yeah, I always have like a bottle of Wesson oil sitting next to me, and if it's too bad.
Yeah.
But one thing I found with that, though, is it tends to be more often than not just there's just too much gain on the amp, too much distortion, and it gets like super sensitive. And of course, for certain extreme types of music, you have to have that kind of gain to get the sound, but then really pay attention to these. But long-winded way of answering the question. I don't really use a de-esser that way. I try to capture it at the source.
Yep.
And if there's something when I'm getting it from somebody else, it's an RX thing for me, where I tend to go for that.
Gotcha. Well, now that we've actually plugged RX as a way to remove some kind of specialized de-essing on guitars, what are your favorite de-essers for actual de-essing?
Well, as of the recording of this podcast, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago as my Friday find, I'm really liking the DS or the FGDS from Slate.
The new one that they just released a little while ago.
Yeah, and I believe it's a recreation of an old DBX compressor, or a de-esser, I'm sorry.
Right.
But that works great. I don't necessarily like the phrase, it's easy to use, but it is really easy to use. Because I think usually when you talk about ease of use or making it easy of use, it just means limited control.
Sure.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. It works really, really great. I did it on a mix here with some vocals just this past week, and that was awesome. Another one I like that's sort of part of the Slate bundle, but it's a plugin from EOSys called the E2 de-esser. That was my de-esser of choice before I got this one.
That one's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of de-essing, isn't it?
Yeah, that is definitely as intricate as you'd want, I think, in the de-esser. I remember us seeing that at the NAMM show when that was about to get released. You can really, really go in and do a lot of stuff with that. So that was my de-esser of choice up to then. But right now, I like the DS or FGDS from Slate. What about you? Do you have one you reach for?
Prior to doing Logic's built-in de-esser, which got a real nice update in Logic 10 point whatever.
I think it was 6, I think. But
Logic's built-in de-esser has a pretty nice functionality to it now in the current version of Logic Pro. Some of the others that I've used is the Universal Audio Precision de-esser, which is also a very nice de-esser. And with the name Precision, you get the impression that, that thing does its job quite well. But
it has to with a name like that.
Right, with a Precision de-esser. Prior to that, it was the Waves Renaissance de-esser that I used almost 100% of the time for a very long time.
I used to have that one too.
Yes, that one was
before I discovered de-essers.
But it does a very nice job, and it's got a highly controllable situation where you can do it as an overall, or you can split the frequencies and have crossovers in it, and it's pretty nice.
Yeah.
However, my current one of super choice, especially during the mix down phase and not at the export of tracking phase, which is where I would use Logic's. If something continues to be a problem in the mix phase and the export phase of the final 2 tracks, OX Sound's Soothe 2.
Oh, I can't believe I didn't think of that. Yeah, that's a brilliant one.
That just becomes the greatest thing since sliced bread when it comes to de-essing. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And for every single episode of this podcast, if you go look at the chain that I use to actually use the concept of how this podcast gets recorded, it's listed 100% of the time because it's there all the time. It is such an amazing de-esser, and OX Sound did brilliance in the making right there.
Isn't that the mark of a truly great de-esser? Like, you don't even realize that you're using it and you have it.
Yes.
It's just so good. It just does what it does.
It does what it does, and it does it very well. And it's not just a de-esser. I mean, you can use it in a de-essing capacity for all kinds of things, but that one is like the de-essing god of choice for me. Is the Soothe.
Yeah, because there again, flexibility with that one, right? It's not just like one knob. It's I really need to dig deeper into the manual of that one, because it's one of those things that you pull up a preset as a starting point and it does its job. It's like, okay, well, that was easy. You don't really have to dive in that really heavily into it.
Right. And it's quite possible that obviously the joke of me doing all that sibilant type crap at the beginning of this particular episode, Soothe 2 may actually deal with a grand portion of it, although it might still sound obviously very annoying with the way I did it, but it won't be as bad as what we just heard when we actually tracked it.
So then the joke is lost on us.
A little bit, yes.
Yeah. Well, let's hope. But if that intro didn't make sense, now you know the reason.
Now you know
why.
the reason why, yes.
Anything else you want to add about the wonderful world of de-essers here, Jody?
No, just be judicious with it is the best way of saying it. That's all I'll say about it. If you get
judicious
way too heavy,
and careful,
judicious and careful. If you get way too heavy-handed, like I said before, it could cause the track to actually sound like it's getting dulled out rather than just being dealt with and not being overpowered. That's all I can say about that.
Yeah, and it is one of those tools, again, just to say, to wrap this up, like I said at the top of the podcast there, it's one of those things that you don't really think about until you really need it.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference that it makes to it is, I mean, it's not sexy at all, but it is vital to have in your tool chest a good de-esser.
Oh, yeah. And with that, let's move on to our Friday finds. Chris, what have you got today?
Well, I believe it was last week or maybe it was the week before, but I mentioned this artist Venus Theory.
Yes.
And through his channel, I discovered a wavetable synth from a company called Vital Audio.
Dun, dun, dun.
And the synth is called Vital.
Well, how about that?
Imagine that. What a coincidence.
So creative.
Right? But it is a wavetable synth, and it's really, really good at doing a lot of things in my workflow. And I'm just, at the top of the iceberg with this. It is more from a sound design and experimental type of a synth. Mm-hmm. It's not there to sound like a Mini Moog or Prophet 5 or anything like that. This is, for me, strictly experimental, and it's really, really cool. I'm just digging into it. And what's really awesome about this as well is that there's a free option. Now, limited option, but it is free option, so you can try it out. If you really like it, there are paid levels as well. And if you like it, you should do that, because it is almost criminal by the person that built this that it actually offers a free version, because it is really, really, really cool. So that is my find for this Friday, Vital by Vital Audio. Mm-hmm. And what about you, Jody? What do you got for us?
Well, I'm on like this bizarre brainwave frequency of you, because I'm also going with a synth plugin as well. Yes. This one is by a company called Fabric 70, and they've released a free synth called Explorer.
Wow.
It has 4 oscillators to it. Mm-hmm. And the first 3, oscillators 1, 2, and 3, can each access a sine, a triangle, a sawtooth, and square type waveforms, and oscillator 4 is reserved for straight up noise. There's also a wave shaper and other filters that are typical on pretty much any synth plugin that you can get at this point. That also has LFOs to it, so you don't have to go get something like
LFO tool?
LFO tool, yes. Yeah. You don't need that because it's got built-in LFO shit. So, yeah. Plus various envelopes and such. But the great thing about it is, as I mentioned, it is free. And you can't be free if you need a synth.
Hopefully it sounds good too, right? But I'm sure it does.
Damn straight. While we've got your attention, we ask that you go to InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and sign up for our mailing list. Doing so will get you weekly reminders about the Tuesday tips when they come out, and we'll make sure you don't miss any future episodes of the podcast. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the word De-Esser. And you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you have a topic or a suggestion for Chris and I to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page, and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. With that, I'll say, see you next week.
Talk to you later, Jody. Thank you so much for listening, people.